everybody. Now, in this, which I think is the fifth of the videos that I'm producing on the play Blood Brothers, I'm going to look at the role of form in the play as a whole. Now, while Russell follows the example of playwrights like Shakespeare, who at times, as with his use of the prologue, Russell is clearly trying to align himself with in some ways. He's trying to assert the right of himself and the working class people to a place in this English literary tradition. So he does borrow elements from other literature, like a magpie in parts of the play, the prologue, that ballad form, which granted is not a Shakespearean feature, but nonetheless it's a historical literary form that he adopts. But there are two main formal elements that dominate the play as a whole, which is absolutely crucial that you know about. Really very much important, and I think that for any candidate aspiring to the higher grades, i.e. 7, 8, 9, I think it's essential that you mention both of these elements, and that is tragedy and conventions or rules of that, and also conventions of drama that is in the Brechtian tradition. More on that in a moment. So let's look at features of tragedy first. Now, first of all, it's worth noting that the tragic form itself goes back to ancient Greece. It's an incredibly ancient literary form, one of the most ancient literary forms, and yet actually, as you will see, it's one that informs many aspects of literature and books, films, television, etc., even today. And what we now think of as not precisely the rules exactly, but the conventions, so the typical features of tragedy were actually set down by the ancient Greek philosopher, thinker, writer Aristotle in a book called the Poetics, or known to us as the Poetics. And these then, in the following slides, are some of the features that he identified. So first of all then, the protagonist, i.e. the main character of a tragedy, he called the tragic hero, and he said that he should conform to certain clearly defined rules. And these are what we expect. First of all, he should begin the play as a noble character of high status. In other words, Aristotle did not believe that ordinary people were fit subjects for drama. Now, this character should meet with initial success. Whatever their initial status, to begin with, things should go well for them. Their status might increase or improve. However, this character will have within them a fatal character flaw, which is known as a hamartia in Greek. Another useful term here. Now, this will include, or perhaps to say, that one of their hamartia may be something called hubris, which is known as excessive or fatal pride, overconfidence, in other words. Which is something that you might expect to see there. There will be others, but that's one that is normally present. These flaws will bring about a turning point in the hero's success, which is known as a peripetia. Again, you'll see that there. Turning point is what we call it in a drama. And as a result of this, the hero suffers the excellently named nemesis, i.e. their destruction, and will typically end up dead. That is what will happen to them. So, just to visualize that then, the path, the trajectory followed by the protagonist in a tragedy is something known as the tragic arc, for obvious reasons, because it forms a curve. So if we just look here then at those points that I mentioned now on the diagram, at the start of the play, that initial high status, further success developing hubris, this pride, hubris leading to peripetia, to that turning point, and then you have the collapse in their fortunes leading to their nemesis, to their destruction. And actually, elements of this can be used to apply to several of the characters in Blood Brothers. Now, firstly, if you think about Mickey, he is a character who seems to meet with some success. After all, by his mid-teens, he's got some money, he gets the girl, and then he gets married, loses his job, goes to jail, and then is killed. In terms of Edward, he probably starts off with higher status than Mickey, but again, he has further success in education, for example, He becomes a counsellor. Um, Now, in the case of Edward, it's interesting because the flaws that destroy him, and arguably the flaws that destroy Mickey as well, perhaps in a sense, are more external than internal. It's shown to be the flaws in society, I think, that actually damage these characters more. And perhaps that's an interesting way, then, that we can say that Russell is subverting the tragic conventions here. The fact that he shows that the seeds of these characters' destruction is not innate within themselves, but is an external factor, a reminder that we are all weak, we are all pawns in the face of society. But even, I suppose, to some extent with Mrs. Johnston, you could argue the same thing. She too follows a similar arc, although again, her status is quite low, but she meets with some success. She has a job, she gets a nice house, she moves to the country, but then everything unravels, and again, as a victim of external circumstances. Now, whatever other themes and ideas are explored in tragedy, traditionally one is a constant, and that is the role of fate. So, in classical tragedy, i.e. those dating back to the time of Aristotle, a key theme was the interplay between destiny, i.e. fate, and free will, the extent to which characters can escape their fate, and what happens to them when they try. Now, just worth mentioning that foreshadowing is frequently used to hint at the sort of fateful ending to come, because, as you've already seen, if there's one thing that you know about tragedy, however much you might hope otherwise, a destruction will be the end result. That's certainly what we see here. But it's worth remembering that attempts to escape your fate are almost inevitably doomed. Think about Romeo and Juliet. They fall in love when they're not meant to because they're from these warring families, and what is the consequence? They both end up dead. Macbeth wants to be the King of Scotland, and he's prepared to do anything, including kill, to get it, and surprise, surprise, in the end, after his initial success, his fortunes collapse, and he is killed. It's a key part of the tragic conventions and the foreshadowing towards it. And if you think back to the two short sections of the play you've already looked at, to the prologue, to the tableau, and then of course to the Mrs. Johnston's song, there's already that foreshadowing. The prologue is pretty obvious in terms of foreshadowing, because it tells us that the two sons will lie slain. The tableau shows them dead. We actually visualise the moment when they die. And for even Mrs. Johnston's song, we talked about the foreshadowing elements in, for example, the references, the allusions to Marilyn Monroe. So clearly the foreshadowing then is used to hint towards how the play will end. What else then? In terms of the structure of the play, the ancient Greeks had some particular features of their drama which carry forward into modern texts that borrow from that tradition. So, due to the enormous size of ancient Greek and Roman amphitheatres, or theatres, I beg your pardon, seating tens of thousands of people in outdoor amphitheatres, the theatre wasn't really, on the whole, an indoor activity. And it's and just to emphasise the size of these, you have a picture on the bottom right here of the amphitheatre at Delphi, which is in Greece itself. But you're looking at somewhere that would be able to seat a crowd, like a football stadium type of size, enormous sized venues. But due to the size of this, they had to adapt the way that they performed and wrote plays in order to actually allow the audience to get something out of it. So, what they would have was a group of actors called the chorus, used to respond to and interpret the action on the stage for the benefit of those in the audience too far away to be able to grasp the details of what was going on. If you look at the bottom left picture there, you'll see a modern recreation, but very much trying to be faithful to those conditions. So it says different masks and exaggerated gestures, i.e. body language, were used to help this. You may have seen sometimes, like the comedy and the tragedy masks, the smiling face and the sad face, The origins of that come from this time, because if you're sitting in the back row, it's impossible for you to read the expression, for example, on an actor's face. So the use of masks were used to communicate feelings more plainly, and yeah, the very physical response. But although they would also sort of chant and speak and otherwise comment on things. It's also associated with this idea of a prologue, of a sort of a short section which kind of previews the play before go at the main action. That's something that Shakespeare, for example, most famously in plays like Romeo and Juliet, also takes on board. Any of you who've ever heard the opening speech there, where they talk about the two households, both alike in dignity, very similar sort of function. And Willie Russell is very much, once again, tapping into that tradition and saying, look, I have as much right, and working class people have as much right to this kind of literary treatment as anybody else does. Now, clearly, in a modern theatre with good acoustics, you have no need for a chorus of however many people to interpret things for you. But in Blood Brothers, then, this role is reduced to that of the narrator. It's a kind of modern adaptation. And I've mentioned about how the use of a prologue also alludes to Shakespeare's tragedies, of which Romeo and Juliet would be a famous example. Now, further rules then for tragedy. Well, Aristotle came up with 3 specific rules to govern them. And he said, first of all, the unity of time. In other words, the plot should take place in as close to real time as possible. So, for example, there shouldn't be any great lapses of time in the way that there are in Blood Brothers, when immediately after the section that we just read, there is a jump forward shortly after this, there is a jump forward of 7 years, a prolapse of 7 years to when the boys are 7. Aristotle said that in order to make it realistic, you shouldn't have those kind of jumps. He also said he also gave something then called the unity of place. He said that the stage should represent a single location. It shouldn't be that one moment it's a ship at sea and the next minute it's somebody's palace. Again, all these I think we can associate with realism. And finally, the unity of action. He said that there should be only one main plot. Any subplots should be kept to a minimum and strictly relevant to the main one. Now, in the case of this play, I think the unity of action, isn't really interfered with, but certainly I would argue that Willie Russell deliberately subverts both of these first two, the unity of time and the unity of place, very plainly, for reasons which I will discuss more in a moment. But obviously the plot, as we said, does make these great leaps forward, and at times it will jump 7 years. In fact, several times it jumps out 7 years. The first Marilyn Monroe song covers a decade of Mrs. Johnston's life. There are other points, like the montage in Act 2, where it goes from them being sort of 14 to 15, 16, something like that, in the space of a single song. And the unity of place, also, the way that the stage very fluidly represents different spaces. One moment it's someone's house, the next moment it's a street, the next moment it's a park. Very plainly then, he is subverting the unity of place as well. Right, now, let's talk a little bit then about some more specific examples of the way that Russell subverts these tragic conventions. I'll give you other examples as we read through the play, but here are some to be beginning with. Now, the protagonists, first of all, are firmly working class rather than noble. It's a deliberate democratization of the tragic form. It's what the playwright Arthur Miller, who, incidentally, was one of Marilyn Monroe's 3 husbands, although I think that's probably a coincidence, but it's what he called tragedy for the common man, a democratization of tragedy. Tragedy for ordinary people. For Russell, the form becomes a tool for political protest at what he saw as injustices in contemporary society. And that's an important point. Russell, very much this is in a sense a protest play, And he wants to do two very specific things. First of all, it's about awareness. He wants to hold up a mirror and show us the world as he sees it. But secondly, it's also a sort of a rallying cry, a call to action, because he wants us to do something about it. He doesn't just want us to come, cosily watch the play, and then go back to our lives. There's something, of course, slightly ironic here, because, of course, then as now, in 1983 as with today, going to the theatre was and is still seen as a slightly middle-class pastime. So it's interesting that all these messages of Russell's are very much being played out to that audience. And I suppose on some levels he probably thinks that it's the middle class who are more likely to be the exploiters in society. It would be the middle classes who are more likely to be in need of reform and of education than the working class characters, who in this play he generally seems to present more as victims. Now, what else then? Like the title characters in Romeo and Juliet, he experiments with the interplay between a pair of protagonists rather than an individual. In this case, rather than being two lovers, it's two brothers, but you have a general idea. Now, what else then? In Blood Brothers, fate is predetermined not by supernatural forces. There are no gods that are determining what happens, nor, indeed, is it governed by internal forces. We don't see people's fate particularly being influenced by their own actions. It's external factors. It's the influence of society, social class, social status. That is what determines the life chances of these people. Trying to escape this is shown to lead to disaster. So Russell is saying that the world needs to change. He's presenting that people are trapped, which of course is vaguely ironic because Willie Russell himself is an example of somebody who has broken the bounds of class, somebody who has, through his own efforts, actually managed to, as it were, promote himself from the working class to the middle class. But he clearly sees himself as a sort of exception rather than the rule. He's saying that for most people, they do not have that same opportunity. So, that is the first important thing then. That governs many aspects of the play, which I will draw your attention to more specifically in the following videos. The second aspect is a much more modern 20th century style of theatre, which in many ways can be seen as quite subversive towards the sort of tragic conventions, and again, for reasons which I will express. So, Brechtian drama then. Why is it called this? Well, it's named after a theatre writer and director called Bertolt Brecht, who lived in the first half of the 20th century. He was a German Jewish playwright and director, as you see there. He left Germany in the 1930s because, obviously, as you know, he would have been persecuted for his beliefs. And he settled first of all Denmark, then in England, and spent the remainder of his life, I believe, in America, North America. He was a passionate left-wing person. So, in other words, we're talking about the wing of politics, sort of like the Labour Party and beyond, moving in the direction of communism. That's the sort of beliefs that he had. So it was all about equality and fairness for all. He was anti-oppression and anti sort of dictator type rulers. That's the kind of feelings that he expressed, and he wrote plays with strong social messages to promote his views. Now, he also pioneered a style which emphasised the theatricality of a play instead of it being totally naturalistic. Now, let me just clarify what that means. Prior to this point, most plays had been in what we call a naturalistic tradition, which is to say that they had been realistic. The emphasis had been on them being believable, things that you could go and watch and lose yourself in and invest in. But Brecht doesn't want that. He wants to keep reminding you that you're watching a play, stop you relaxing into it. And he calls this, it has a name in German which is very long, known sometimes in English as the V effect, but we can call it alienation. This idea is called alienation. It's this idea that he doesn't want an audience to get lost in the world. He wants us to be constantly reminded that you're watching a play so that you can objectively judge the moral and the meaning. And think back to what the narrator says in the prologue that you read a couple of videos ago. Come in and judge for yourselves how they claim to play this part. He's telling us right from the off. He doesn't want us to identify with characters. He doesn't want us to get lost in it. He wants us to sit above, to evaluate, and to judge, to learn. Now, you might also say that when he uses phrases like play this part, and again in the first line of Mrs. Johnston's say it's just a story, he's emphasising once again that this is not real. Even though he wants to suggest to us that these are the kind of things that are happening, at the same time he's reminding us that this play itself is not real. We have to judge it. Now, some of his ideas, which I'll go on from the next slide, were borrowed or influenced by early cinema. Now, Berlin, which is where he lived and worked, in the 1920s and 30s was a hotbed of experimentation in this area. Some of you might, for example, have seen clips from a famous film called Nosferatu, which is like a sort of Dracula-type vampire with a bald head on the prowl. There was a film called Metropolis, directed by a chap called Fritz Lang, which showed a sort of futuristic space city. And then later, in the 1930s, the Nazis themselves sort of harnessed a lot of this filmmaking talent. So, for example, there was actually a female director called Leni Riefenstahl, who was employed by Hitler to make what are actually really striking videos of Nazi parades and marches, and it was all part of the sort of propaganda machine to present Nazism as some kind of noble movement. So it was really a powerful period for the cinema in Berlin, and he borrows ideas from that, is what I'm saying. Now, Brecht's purpose, like Russell, was clearly didactic. Didactic essentially means educational, with the aim to teach. Clearly didactic, but he understood the value of entertainment to engage an audience long enough to communicate what he was trying to say. In other words, people don't learn if they're bored, so he tried to make the plays fun in order that people would get something from it. So, some features then. First of all then, use of things like song and dance. Well, already we've seen that in this play, but again, it's used for many things, including exposition, which we've already mentioned, but also in terms of alienation. People in their everyday lives don't just burst into song and tell you their life story. Alienation, emphasising theatricality. Secondly then, something called Spaß. Some of you who study German will come across this word. It simply means fun in German, and again it links to this idea of the use of entertainment to sell the point. Now, things like tableau, the freeze frame, like the one that you've already seen, again, that's a film idea, isn't it? The idea of sort of stopping of the action. And you also have something called montage, which again is where you have a sort of a series of sort of short clips, often played over music or a song, or in the case of in this play, sometimes also sort of happening in mime while the narrator is narrating. A famous example of montage is probably the film Rocky, if anyone's ever seen that, and it's famously where the boxer Rocky Marciano is preparing for his fight, and so the montage takes you through his training routine, famously to the tune "The Eye of the Tiger." Some of you may have seen that. If not, it's worth a YouTube. It's a kind of iconic cinema moment. What else then? Now, something that we call self-conscious multi-rolling. I'll just go through and explain what that is, but firstly I'll just draw your attention to the spelling of rolling. Now, normally the word rolling we would spell with a double L, but if you do that it changes the meaning completely. It has to be rolling with a single L because it's referring to a role, a part that an actor plays. So let me explain then. Multi-rolling is a very common thing. You'll probably all have seen examples of this, but it's where a an actor, usually one of the more minor actors in a theatre company, will play several parts in the course of the play, several minor parts. So in itself, it's a very common thing. It happens all the time. It saves money and things like that. And if an actor only has a part with 3 lines, at least if he gets to come back on later and have another part with only 3 lines, it makes him feel a bit better about it. So it's a very common thing. But what Bertolt Brecht does is he makes it self-conscious. In other words, instead of trying to disguise it, instead of making it so that the first time the character comes on with a blonde wig and a moustache, and then later he comes on with a white hair wig and a beard, instead of trying to disguise this fact, Bertolt Brecht really draws attention to it. In other words, he makes it self-conscious, he makes it obvious. Again, it's linked to this idea of the emphasising of theatricality. So, for example, in the case of this play here, you have the milkman, who then suddenly becomes the gynecologist, and Willie Russell makes a joke of this because Mrs. Johnson says something like, "Oh, no more milk, thank you," and he says, "Oh, not today, darling. I'm a gynecologist." Now that is spas. It's amusing. The idea that a milkman could suddenly have a career change and start inspecting ladies' anatomies is in itself funny, if slightly disturbing. But it draws our attention to it, and once again emphasises the theatricality, reminds us that this is not real. Flexible use of actors. So, for example, the fact that the same actors play the characters from the age of 7 through to their death in their 20s is again a thing. It emphasises the theatricality. The fact that you have a 25-year-old actor, or whatever it is, playing a 7-year-old boy, that's a Brechtian thing, again emphasises theatricality. Use of narration, very Brechtian feature, again, it breaks that sort of realism for us. It breaks that fourth wall, as it were. Now, these last two here are particularly subversive in terms of the unities that I talked about when I was discussing tragedy. First of all, then, the idea of a fractured narrative. So instead of it being linear, a straight line from beginning to middle to end, which would conform to the unity of time, you have these great gaps, 7 years here, and then at other points, suddenly time will speed up and things like that. And the use of the short episodic scenes that go with that as well, particularly towards the beginning of Act 2. There's a whole sequence of very short scenes that chop around as the play starts to gain pace towards this inevitable ending. And finally, the flexible use of staging, which again subverts the Aristotelian unity of place. The fact that one moment the stage will be a park and a moment later it will be the inside of Mrs. Lyon's house. So there we are. In fact, many of these Brechtian features can themselves be said to subvert tragic features, e.g. the unities, to further Russell's political points in the play, and particularly linking to the idea of alienation, which Russell really wholeheartedly adopts. In fact, I think it's fair to say that he adopts a lot of these Brechtian features almost wholesale. One thing then that's just worth mentioning before I wind up this video, this is Willie Russell's production note, which you'll find in your copies. It usually happens just before the cast list from the first production, so it's a couple of pages before it starts. I've missed a little bit out in the middle that's not relevant to you, but it just emphasises some of the Brechtian features I mentioned. So it says, first of all, the setting of Blood Brothers is an open stage with the different settings and time spans being indicated by lighting changes with the minimum of properties and furniture. Very Brechtian so far. And secondly, we see the interior of the Lions as comfortable home, but usually only the exterior front door of the Johnston house, with the interior scenes taking place outside the door, again emphasising theatricality, and the area between the two houses acting as a communal ground for street scenes, park scenes, etc. So really, this is without actually saying I am using Brechtian features. This is Willie Russell really saying to us in quite plain terms that there are many Brechtian aspects to this production. Now, before I finish, I will just say this. Particularly in this video, we're talking about some ideas that are quite sophisticated, but correspondingly they're very well worth grasping because they really, I think, do help you at the highest level. Really profoundly so, and I think that I would expect any candidate at 7 and above, especially at 8 and 9, to refer to both tragic features and to the Brechtian features in their writing on the play, and to link it to Willie Russell's purpose. So not simply to identify that he's using them, but to state why. Link it to his social purposes. Link it perhaps even to his artistic ambitions for the status of the play. I'll continue to refer to them and to emphasize these ideas in the videos that follow, so don't feel unduly alarmed just now, but it's absolutely worth getting your head around these ideas now. They're very, very valuable, I think. Anyway, thank you very much, and I will resume shortly.